everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. This is pretty exciting. This is our first virtual program that we've done, and I'm really excited that all of you could join us. And first, I just want to give a big thanks to Michaela for being our Zoom wizard and setting this up and facilitating this and helping it all to run smoothly. And I also want to give a huge thanks to Shireen Ash at the Corte Madera Library, who we partnered with for this event. When this whole shutdown started, Shireen and I talked about the possibility of doing some virtual programming because I've done lectures at the Corte Madera Library in the past. And so it's super exciting that we're finally getting around to doing that. So with that, I think we can hop into the PowerPoint. And I need to share my screen. So give me a second here. Okay. That looks like that's working now, so hopefully everybody can see this. And so today we're going to talk about butterflies. And I am Shannon Burke. I'm the Marin County Parks Interpretive Naturalist. And Marin County Parks manages 34 different open space preserves and 39 different parks. And in non-COVID times, we offer a lot of public programming. We offer ranger walks and volunteer events and naturalist events. And as I said, this is our first virtual program, so hopefully going forward we'll be doing more things like this until we can all get back out on the trails again. Okay, so first I just want to say that today's talk isn't really about identifying butterflies. We're going to focus more on their life stories and interesting things about butterflies, and I'll show these resources at the end as well. But I just want to point out that if you're looking to learn more about butterfly identification, there's some really great resources out there. Okay, so humans have probably been captivated by butterflies since humans existed because they're gorgeous, they're spectacular, fragile flying creatures. And they also go through this mind-bending transformation called metamorphosis, which most people are probably familiar with. But it's where you have a larva going to a pupa, going to an adult. So it's the caterpillar, the chrysalis, and the adult. And a lot of different insects go through metamorphosis, but butterflies are kind of known to be the really captivating creatures that do this. Okay, so let's dive into the different stages. Eggs are these amazing structures. They have these really cool little ridges in some cases, and some even have the capacity to absorb air and hold air. Even if they're submerged underwater or buried in snow, this can be for weeks or even months in some cases. And here we have an itty-bitty tiny little monarch caterpillar hatching out of its egg. And it promptly turns around and eats the eggshell. So it does this for a couple of reasons. One, it's recycling the nutrients. And then secondly, if it eats the eggshell, there's less chance of a would-be predator realizing that there's this tasty little tiny caterpillar in the area. So once it hatches, the caterpillar moves through these different phases called instars. So these are different stages. So you see the first instar is really small, then it gets bigger up until the fifth instar. And these stages are punctuated by molts. So butterflies are insects, and insects have exoskeletons, which are fairly hard. And even though caterpillars are pretty soft-bodied, they still have an exoskeleton that can only expand so much as they grow. So they need to create a new skin and then shed the old skin. Typically what they do once they shed is they turn around and they eat that old skin. So for the same reason that they eat the eggshell, they're recycling those nutrients. The head capsule, which is protecting the head, is harder. It's just a tougher material. That part's inedible, so they eat all of the skin except for the head generally. Once they've gone through all of these stages and they've eaten enough and they've grown enough, then they get ready to pupate. And the first thing they do is they create what's called a silk button, this little pad made out of silk. And as a lot of you are probably aware, spiders create silk, and they have spinnerets at the end of their abdomens. In caterpillars, the spinnerets are actually on the lower lip in the mouth, and they're attached to modified salivary glands where the silk is produced. So once it creates that silk button, then it grabs onto it with the end of its body. And then it begins its final transformation from a caterpillar to a chrysalis. So it expands and it splits its old skin, and it gradually works it off of its body. So it kind of works it up by moving fluids and gases. So it's kind of this undulating movement that works it all the way up to the top. And then if you look all the way over on the right to that picture, you can see that blue arrow is pointing at some little black dots there. Those are called clasping buttons. So right before the skin is finally shed, it grabs onto the silk button with those little clasping buttons, and it flips off the skin. And then it takes that black stem that you can see is attached to it, and it really embeds it, and that's called the cremaster. And it has all of these little hooks on the tip. So here's a magnified look at the cremaster with all of those hooks and the silk button. And so at this point, the chrysalis kind of gyrates around, and it pushes that up really hard into the silk button to get a really good hold. And so that way it can be suspended as it goes through pupation. So the pupal stage is fascinating. You're moving from a caterpillar, which is kind of this blob of a shape, right? It's got not very well-defined legs. It doesn't have wings. It has chewing mouth parts. And it's going to be transformed to something completely different, a butterfly, which has long legs and it has wings. And instead of a chewing mouth part, it has sort of a straw-like mouth part. So what happens is you have almost complete cellular breakdown. Everything breaks down except for the nervous system and these clusters of cells called imaginal discs. So you kind of end up with this soup. It's like this nutrient broth. And those imaginal discs, I love that name because it sounds like they're imagining turning into a butterfly. Anyway, so they take those nutrients that were the larva and they transform them to create the adult. And then you can see these cases where the wings are going to be and the legs and the eye, and that's where those parts will eventually develop. And I want to just draw your attention to the proboscis, which is the tongue, basically. And if you look here, the entire pupa, the chrysalis, is symmetrical, including that tongue. It's split in two different parts, right? So just remember that. We'll get back to that in a second. Okay. So then in the final stages, you can actually see the butterfly through the cuticle. So you can see the wings developing, the patterning, and the coloring. This is a California dog-faced butterfly. Really beautiful. I love this photo and this one. So then when it's ready to emerge, it splits out of the skin and it has to hang. So if you look at the left, the wings are really small and crumpled, and it's going to use gravity and blood to pump those wings out. And at this stage, it has to be able to hang freely without its wings being obstructed, because once they're fully formed, then they dry and harden. And at that point, they can't change shape. They no longer grow. So if the wings are impeded in any way, then they can end up being malformed and the butterfly won't be able to fly. All right, so remember I mentioned that proboscis that we were going to get back to? Okay, so here is a little skipper butterfly, and it's got this great coiled tongue. Butterflies have coiled tongues that they can uncoil and coil, and in the center, it's hollow. There's this channel that runs through it so that they can drink liquid. They can only drink liquid or tiny little particles that can be suspended. But when they first emerge, that proboscis is still split into two pieces, and it has this tongue and groove overlay that has to be zipped together. So the butterfly coils and uncoils that tongue until it zips together. And here you can kind of see where it's zipped. It looks just like a zipper, right? Okay, so once its wings are fully formed and the tongue is ready to drink nectar, it starts visiting plants. And so it feeds off of flowers, and flowers provide nectar, and nectar provides sugars. So that's the main food source for butterflies. Oops. And they can get sugar from things other than flowers in some cases. So here's a red admiral, and they're known for getting sugar from other sources. So they can visit rotting fruit or damaged fruit or even sap oozing out of trees. Another thing that is really common that you see is groups of butterflies gathered in wet soil or mud, and this is called puddling or mud puddling. And females will do this as well, but for the most part, this is males. This is young males. What they're doing is they're drinking dissolved salts. And those salts are thought to be really important for reproduction. And in fact, during mating, the male will end up transferring sodium along with sperm to the female. So it's kind of this paternal investment. And then these delicate, beautiful creatures will also feed off of dung. So dung provides salts and it also provides protein. And they'll even feed on carrion. Carrion provides salts, proteins, and nitrogen. And so I had mentioned that they can't eat solid foods. So if they're trying to get nutrients off of a substrate or something like that, they can actually emit saliva or eject fluid out of their rear end, and then that will dissolve those nutrients so that then they can drink them up through that tongue. Okay, so once they have all the nutrients they need, then they're ready to find a mate. And butterflies do this behavior. It's a mate finding behavior, mate location behavior called hill topping. And what happens is males will head to the top of a hill, and if it's a flat landscape, it might just be a tiny little rise in the landscape, but they will congregate up at the top of the hill, and they will kind of vie for the best spot. So they'll chase each other, they'll have these skirmishes. Sometimes you'll see them circling really tightly around each other, going up, 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 up into the air, and then one finally drops. So the males go through these skirmishes, and ultimately the fittest male, the strongest male, ends up being king of the hill. And when a female is ready to mate, all she has to do is go uphill. She has to find a hill and fly up it. And there's a really good chance that there will be males at the top. And the one at the very top will be the most genetically fit. And so she'll test his fitness and endurance by having him chase her for a bit. And then if he's lucky, then that courtship will culminate in mating. But sometimes it doesn't. So this is a female in an unreceptive pose. Her wings are held out at her side and her abdomen is raised. And then the male is flying above her. And if she's in this position, he can't really approach her. So if she's ready to mate and she has chosen that male, then what she does is she'll be in a receptive position. So in this case, her wings are folded and her abdomen is held down so that he can get up next to her, and he has claspers on the tip of his abdomen that he attaches to the tip of her abdomen. And then they ultimately end up in this position. So that's what it looks like when butterflies are mating. And it takes about 20 minutes typically for sperm to be transferred. And at this point, that's when he's transferring what's called a spermatophore that has some other accessory things in it, including that sodium that he got when he was mud puddling. So sometimes they'll stay coupled like this up to a couple hours. If it's in the evening, then they might even spend the night like this. And if they get disturbed, then they can take flight. But it would be really difficult if they were both flapping their wings. They'd kind of be headed in different directions, and it'd be really kind of herky-jerky. So what happens is one flies and the other one is carried. And in some species, the male does the flying, and in some species, the female does the flying. So once they've mated, then the female starts to look for a host plant to lay her eggs on. So what's the difference between a host plant and a nectar plant? You hear the term host plant a lot with butterflies, and it's really important. So nectar plants are flowers that butterflies visit, and there's a wide range of different plants that butterflies will get nectar from. The host plants are what the caterpillars eat, and a lot of species have developed relationships with really specific plants. And in some cases, those plants contain toxic compounds, that as the caterpillar is feeding, it ends up sequestering in its body, and then those compounds end up protecting the caterpillar and the butterfly, and in some cases eggs, from predation of vertebrate species, so things like birds. So, for instance, the pipevine swallowtail lays its eggs on the California pipevine, The California pipevine has what are called aristolocheic acids. They have these toxins that make it really unedible to most things. These caterpillars are one of the few things that eats this plant. And so the caterpillar eats away and it builds up those toxins. When it turns into a butterfly, the butterfly has those chemicals in its body as well, so it's distasteful to birds. And then when the female lays her eggs, those eggs are also protected. So if a bird were to come along and eat these eggs, it might get sick. And so this species has these bright orange eggs, and that's warning coloration, which we'll talk more about in a minute. But a lot of species only lay one egg in one place at a time, and a lot of butterflies actually have to take a short little flight before they can physiologically lay another egg. And so that helps spread the eggs out so that predators can't find them. But in a case like this, those eggs are protected so they can be laid all together. But those toxins don't protect the butterflies in any of the stages from other insects, only from vertebrates. So things like predatory wasps, parasitic wasps and flies will take advantage of caterpillars. And the difference between a parasite and a parasitoid is a parasite feeds on multiple hosts throughout its life and it doesn't kill it. So if you think of, let's say you've got 3 cats and there's a flea that might feed off of all 3 of them, but it won't kill any of your cats, right? Opposed to a parasitoid that only has one host, in this case the caterpillar, and it lives off of that one host its entire life, and then it ultimately ends up killing it. So you can have, for instance, a wasp larva that would be living inside the body of a caterpillar, and it's slowly eating away at the insides of the caterpillar. It eats everything except the non-essential organs, so that that caterpillar can continue to feed and grow and get big, so that ultimately there's more for that wasp larva to eat, right? And then it ends up going through, the caterpillar will create the chrysalis, and at that point, that wasp larva will end up devouring and completely eating the caterpillar. And then it goes through metamorphosis inside of the butterfly chrysalis. And so sometimes you have wasps instead of butterflies emerging from these chrysalises. And you can see here where it's chewed a hole out the side. So if you see a little hole where it's emerged like that, you know that that's a parasite or a parasitoid instead of a butterfly that's come out. Okay, so all stages of the butterfly life are fraught with peril. They can also have infections like bacterial infections. This is called Black Death, that this poor caterpillar has succumbed to. And predators. So a lot of wasps are predatory in addition to being parasitic, different species. And what they do is they will actually take sort of the meat of the caterpillar and they'll take it back to their hive and feed it to their larvae. So a lot of wasps eat a lot of caterpillars. And spiders, like crab spiders, will eat caterpillars. They'll also eat butterflies. Dragonflies will eat butterflies. And birds. So birds eat a ton of caterpillars. They're up in the trees, they're moving around in plants, and so they find a lot of caterpillars. Especially during the breeding season, they'll feed a lot of caterpillars to their young when they're still in the nest and once they fledge. Okay, so remember those chemical defenses? This is where it gets important. So this is the study that was done on blue jays and monarch butterflies. Monarchs are toxic species. So in the first frame, you see the jay is taking off the wings of the butterfly. In the second photo, it eats the butterfly. And in the third, it kind of looks like it's not feeling too well, right? Okay, so then in the fourth, it actually throws up. So butterflies that are toxic usually have what's called warning coloration, and birds learn this. So if they ate something that looked like this and got sick, the next time they see a brightly colored butterfly, and usually those warning colors are orange and black or red and black, they're going to think twice about eating it because they're going to remember that they got sick the last time. So, whoops. Here's another species that's toxic, the California sister. And the caterpillars of this species eat oak leaves, and oak leaves are really high in tannins. So they make them unpalatable to birds. And I just want to point out, again, it's this bright kind of black and orange patterning. So that orange is a nice dot toward the edge wing and there's a black border around it. In some cases, you get mimicry. So look at this one. This looks almost identical. This is a Lorcan's Admiral. And instead of having that black border, the orange kind of runs off the edge of the wing. So look at how similar these look. This one, which is toxic, and this one actually isn't toxic, but it's sort of faking it. So it looks enough like the California sister that if a bird has eaten a California sister and gotten sick, it's probably not going to eat one of these. Okay, so we've talked about some of our common species, but we can take a deeper dive, and we'll start with the skippers. This is a group of butterflies that are really common. Grass skippers look a lot like this little one. They tend to be orange with brown markings, and we have several species here that look pretty similar. One thing that sets the skippers apart is that they have curved antennae. So this is a silver spotted skipper. And I love this photo because you can see the curved antennae in the shadow, actually. So they've got that nice hook at the edge of their antennae, or the tip of their antennae, opposed to this. This is kind of what a typical butterfly looks like. It's more clubbed. So antennae are olfactory organs. They use them to smell, more or less. They can find food like flowers, nectar plants. They can find mates. They can find host plants. Okay, next we're going to move on to the whites and the sulfurs. And this is the cabbage white. We saw these guys earlier in the show being a little frisky with each other. And so I just want to point out the difference between the male and the female. The female has 2 dots on her forewing where the male only has 1. And this is a non-native species. It's found pretty much everywhere. It feeds on things in the mustard family. So this is a really widespread introduced species. So you can find it in a lot of open habitats, typically not in deep shade. Opposed to the gray-veined white, which also feeds on mustards. And when its wings are open, it looks a lot like the cabbage white, but when they're closed, you get these nice gray veins on it. And this species prefers actually shaded areas. So it's found more in woodlands and forests, kind of in dappled white. All right, so this is pretty cool. This is the Sarah orange tip. And you see the male and the female here, and to our human eyes, they look pretty similar. If you look at the male, the border around the orange is a nice solid black, and on the female, it's broken, kind of this broken black pattern, right? So we might have a hard time telling them apart, especially in flight. But butterflies can see in the ultraviolet range. And that orange spot on the male is actually UV reflective, and so to butterflies it looks purple, whereas the orange spot on the female absorbs ultraviolet and it looks orange. So butterflies have a much easier time telling themselves apart than we do in this species. All right, the orange sulfur is this beautiful butterfly. It's very yellow, and when it's flying, you just kind of see this yellow butterfly flitting over fields. Again, the male and the female look a little bit different. The male has a black border, whereas the female's, that border is a little bit broken out. Okay, swallowtails. So they are called swallowtails because they have these extensions on their hind wing, and those tails kind of twist a little bit, and they can end up looking very thin. So they almost look like antennae. So the back end of the hind wing kind of looks like a false head. If a bird were to try to catch one of these, it would probably go for what it thinks is the head. And in that way, the most vulnerable part of the butterfly wouldn't be damaged, and hopefully it could fly away. So I just want to point this out because I think this is really cool. So this occurs in different species, but especially in the swallowtails, it's really pretty obvious. Here are 2 different chrysalises, and they are the same exact species, but the one on the left, the caterpillar, as it was crawling around finding a place to pupate, walked through green vegetation. So it ended up green. So it's going to be camouflaged in the area that it decided to pupate in, whereas the one on the right walked around in kind of dry, dead vegetation. And so it ended up brown. So it's going to be better camouflaged in that area. So in some cases, they might skew to green earlier in the season, like the spring, when things are more green, and then later in the fall, when things have dried up, they might be more brown. And all swallowtails have this organ called an osmeterium. So this is usually hidden. It's usually tucked away inside this little slit behind the head. But if the caterpillar feels threatened, it exerts that, and it gives off this really bad smell. So that can alarm a predator, just having that little orange thing stick out suddenly, and also give off a bad smell. So that can help to keep predators from eating it. And all of the instars have them. I think this is so cute. This is an itty bitty little anise swallowtail caterpillar, and it's exerting its osmeterium. And then I also want to point out that its coloring is black, and it's got this kind of large white splotch in the middle. So at a distance, this might look like a bird dropping. And how about this one? So the western tiger swallowtails, their first instar or two really looks like a bird dropping. So they hang out up in trees. They feed off of willows and alders. So they're kind of high up in treetops where a lot of birds are hopping around looking for things to eat. And if you were a bird looking for something to eat, chances are you would not want to eat a bird dropping, right? So this is a way of protecting those first stages of the caterpillar. And then later, as they get bigger, they have these false eyes. So the western tiger swallowtail and also the pale swallowtail caterpillar looks a lot like this. They have these eye spots, and they can actually kind of inflate them. So again, if a bird was hopping around, it might think that this is a small snake or something like that with those big eyes. So here's a photo where you can see the eye spots, and then you can actually see the true eye. So the head is kind of tucked under the front. And when it grows up, this is what it looks like. And I just want to compare, we have three different tiger or swallowtail species that look somewhat similar. So this is the western tiger swallowtail with this nice yellow color. And if you look at the leading edge of the wing, it has a fair amount of yellow there compared to the anise swallowtail, which has a lot of black on that leading wing. So even in flight, that can be pretty obvious to see. This is a little bit trickier, the pale swallowtail. So the males are pretty easy. They're black and white. The background is white on these. But on the female, they're kind of a pale yellow, and it can be close to the color of a western tiger swallowtail, but not quite. And if you, again, notice the leading edge, there's not quite as much yellow there as there is on the western tiger swallowtail. But differentiating between those can be a little bit tricky. Okay, so we already talked about the pipeline swallowtail, but I wanted to show you what they look like with their wings open. So this is a male. He's got this really wonderful blue iridescence. And then the female is more brown. She doesn't have that. All right, so here are some nice swallowtail legs. So I just wanted to point out that most groups of butterflies have, butterflies are insects, and adult insects have 6 legs. So most groups of butterflies, you can see 6 legs if you were to look closely. There's this group of butterflies called brushfoots, and it looks like they only have 4 legs. And what's going on there is their front legs are really modified. They're greatly reduced. And in the females, these are basically tasting organs. And so if they are looking for a host plant to lay their eggs on, they go around and they brush, they're called brushfoots because they brush those feet against a plant, and they can actually taste the chemicals and find the appropriate host plant to lay their eggs on. All right, so this is a buckeye butterfly. This is one of our most common species of brushfoots that we have here. And you can see these big eye spots. So again, same idea as the swallowtails. If a bird were to go for this, it would go for what it thinks is the head. And so that would divert attention away from the actual head. So sometimes you can see buckeye butterflies that look like this. And it's interesting. Birds don't actually catch a lot of butterflies when they're in flight, but they do prey on them, and that's usually when the butterfly is cold. So that would be early in the morning or on a cloudy day where it's just a little bit too cold to get away quickly. And I want to point out these caterpillars because they're pretty common. So these are the caterpillars of the buckeye. This photo shows a lot of blue, but in real life, they kind of look black with orange spots. And they look really similar to the variable checker spot caterpillar. And both of these caterpillars feed on plants that contain what are called iridoid glycosides. So that includes things in the snapdragon family and the plantain family. One of the plants that you see them on really frequently is sticky monkey flower. And they can kind of aggregate, so you can see several on one. And it's because they're protected by those compounds, those chemicals. And so when the variable checker spot grows up, it looks like this. And it, again, has that great warning coloration, that black and red. We also have northern checker spots, and they are more of an orangey color, orange and blackish. And I just want to point out the Mylita crescent can look pretty similar to the northern checker spot, and they're related, but look at this little row of black dots at the base or the back end of the hind wing. And the Mylita crescents are much smaller. They're really common species. Their caterpillars eat thistles, so they're pretty widespread. So if you see a little orange butterfly flitting around, it's probably going to be this one. But again, here's the northern checker spot. It doesn't have that row of black dots, whereas the Mylita crescent does. Okay, so monarchs. I could probably have spent this entire time talking about monarchs, but there's a lot of great monarch information out there. And so I'm just kind of going to go over the main points for monarchs. As a lot of you are probably aware, the monarchs are really in trouble right now. So since the 1980s, their populations have declined by 99%, really extreme. There are a few factors that contribute to that. One is that their overwintering sites have been impacted, and so they are losing a lot of overwintering sites. Their breeding habitat, like especially here in California in the Central Valley, has been converted to agriculture or developed, so they're losing a lot of breeding habitat where the caterpillars would be feeding off of milkweed, which is their host plant. And then also pesticides. So there have been studies done that show really high levels of pesticides in these populations. And then in some places also herbicides that are wiping out the milkweed, which the caterpillars depend on to eat. So most people are probably familiar with the migration of monarchs and that it's a multi-generational migration. But I don't know if everybody's aware, we have two distinct populations in North America. And so to the east of the Rockies, you have the eastern monarchs, and to the west of the Rockies, you have the western monarchs. So we have the western monarchs, and this time of year, late summer, fall, they start moving from inland locations and they head to the coast to spend the winter. The eastern monarchs all go down to Mexico. So from all across that huge area, they funnel down and overwinter in Mexico. Ours stay on the California coast for the winter. And so right now they're moving through our area and our native milkweed is still up. And so some of those individuals might take advantage of that and they might breed and lay their eggs on that milkweed. And then those caterpillars will grow up, turn into butterflies. And before the winter time, they will fly to the coast. Some of the butterflies that are moving through aren't going to breed. They're just going to head directly to the coast. And then they end up in these huge mass groups, right, where they all hang out together. And along the coast, the temperature is really pretty perfect. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. So it's a nice place to spend the winter. And they're pretty inactive. And then in the spring, when things start to warm up, you get this mass mating event where they all mate and then they begin to disperse and they head back. And so as they start to head back to north and east, right, they're going to take advantage of different populations of milkweed that is emerging at different times. So they fly, they find milkweed, they lay their eggs, those individuals die, and then the caterpillars that hatch from those eggs are going to feed on that milkweed, grow up into butterflies, and then they're going to fly the next leg of the journey and hit right as that milkweed is emerging in that area and take advantage of that. So this multi-generational migration occurs. Here in Marin, this is our native milkweed. This is narrow-leafed milkweed. And if you're going to plant milkweed in your garden, this is probably what you want to plant. And it's got these nice narrow leaves. And so again, these have compounds that when the caterpillars eat them, end up protecting the whole life cycle. And then that's the case with all milkweed. And this is showy milkweed, which is also native to Marin, but to the best of my knowledge, we don't have any remaining wild populations. I know you can still buy this in nurseries and plant it in your yard. But you don't want to plant this one. So this is tropical milkweed, and it's sold in a lot of nurseries. And the problem with this one is our native species of milkweed die back in the wintertime, and this one doesn't. And there's a parasite, which is a type of protozoa, that as the butterflies fly around, they transfer that parasite from milkweed plant to milkweed plant. And so it gets on the leaves, and then when the caterpillars eat the leaves, they end up getting that protozoan parasite inside their bodies. And if there are high enough levels of that, it can really negatively impact them. So it can affect their growth. It can even affect their ability to migrate. And so because this species doesn't die out in the winter, that parasite ends up sort of building up. And so you don't want to plant this here because you can end up sort of encouraging that parasite to really take off. Another thing is if this species is planted too close to overwintering sites, the butterflies might decide to breed and to lay eggs when they actually should be really resting and kind of shutting down for the winter instead of using the energy to breed and lay eggs. So one of the best things you can do if you're trying to help monarchs is actually plant flowering plants, especially things that are blooming in the summer and the fall. And the reason for that is because these butterflies have made this migration here. So they've flown all the way here and they've used up their fat reserve. And so they need to sort of gain weight again before winter hits. So they need to replenish those reserves by drinking a lot of nectar. And so when they get to Marin, it's great if they have a lot of flowers that they can drink the nectar from, and then that'll help them to survive the winter. And not only are you helping monarchs, but you're helping a lot of other butterfly species and even other pollinators like bees and stuff. Okay, so this is another migratory species. This is the California tortoiseshell, and it comes and spends the winter here, typically in canyons. So it overwinters as adults, and then in the spring, it heads east up into the mountains or north, and as it's again another multi-generational migrant. And so its larvae feed off of Ceanothus. And so again, it's following that emerging Ceanothus as it's just leafing out across its range. So the butterflies fly, they lay their eggs on the Ceanothus as it's leafing out in one spot. Those caterpillars grow up, turn into butterflies. They fly to a higher altitude where the Ceanothus is just starting to leaf out, and so on. So again, multi-generational. So some years, they actually will lay their eggs here in Marin before they leave, and you can end up with these, what are called eruption years, where you get these huge numbers of them. And this happened a few years ago. So here are some caterpillars on the Ceanothus munching away. And I went up to Inverness Ridge when this occurred a couple years ago, where there were just tons of them, and they had just started pupating. So I have this great video that I'm gonna hopefully share. And the pupae do this fascinating thing. They respond to sound, and they gyrate. So if you're ever walking through the woods and it suddenly seems to come to life, it might be that you're hallucinating, but it might just be that there are a whole bunch of these chrysalises that are shaking around in response to the noise that you're making, especially if you're talking. So here's a close-up. Here are two chrysalises, and the one on the right is going to be gyrating violently. I just think this is so cool. So this probably is an adaptation to sort of scare off birds and even parasites like wasps. So if something gets too close to it, it can react like that and hopefully avoid predation. All right, another migrant is the painted lady. And for the most part, when they're migrating, they move to the east of the Sierra Nevada. But in some years, we get them moving through Marin as well. So they spend the winter as adults down near the Mexican-California border. And then in years where we get super blooms in the deserts, the caterpillars take advantage of that, and you can end up with huge numbers of butterflies moving. And then sometimes they get kind of blown off course and end up over toward the coast. And so that's when you get some of them moving up this site. All right, so the last butterfly in this group of brushfoots that we're going to talk about is the California ringlet. And these guys have 2 different broods per year. In the spring, they're kind of grayish and they're a little bit brighter, and that helps them blend in with grasses, which are what the caterpillars eat. And so they kind of blend in with that fresh vegetation when everything is there's just more moisture in the environment. And then the second brood looks just like dried grass. It's really amazing how well these guys blend in. So next and last is the blues. This is a group of butterflies. They're beautiful. They're very small butterflies, and they can all look fairly similar with their wings open. They're this nice blue color, and they just kind of flit about. But one of the really cool things, I love this about blues, is that their caterpillars exude honeydew, which attracts ants. And so the ants eat that honeydew. It's a sugary substance. And in some cases, these caterpillars will even stridulate their body and make these rasping noises to communicate with the ants. And so the ants protect them from predators and parasites. And in some cases, they'll even take the caterpillar down into the ant nest, and the caterpillar could spend months down there, like up to 9 months down there. In some cases, they'll pupate in the ant nest, and then they have to make their way back out as a butterfly. Sometimes the caterpillar will actually eat the ant larvae, so it isn't really a very polite house guest in those cases. But anyway, just really interesting relationship. So the blues, for the most part, you want to look at the underside of the wing to identify them. So we're just going to look at a couple. We have several species here in Marin. But the silvery blue is pretty easy to identify. This is a species that is tended by ants, by the way. And so they have these nice black dots that are surrounded by a white halo. And then the Akmon blue is also pretty easy to identify. It has this great orange border on the edge of the hind wing. And you'll notice that this one looks pretty brown. So in this group of butterflies, typically the males are more blue and the females are more brown. And again, this is a common species here. And then I just want to touch on the mission blue. So this is a federally endangered species and found in this area. And probably the biggest remaining population is San Bruno Mountain, where there's a conservation plan in place to protect them. And then here in Marin, there's a population in the Marin headlands, and they've done a lot of restoration work there to benefit this species. And last and least is the Western Pygmy Blue. These are so dang cute. This is the smallest butterfly in North America and one of the smallest butterflies in the world. And here you can find them in wetland habitats. And they also will take advantage of sort of weedy succulent plants that grow in vacant lots and industrial areas. So again, here are some great resources if you want to dive deeper into trying to identify butterflies. The one on the left is a laminated fold-out card, and it has most of our common species. And then the one on the right is a field guide book put out by UC Press. And this is a great resource. It has a really wonderful introduction with tons of information, has very detailed species accounts, and then it also has really good drawings. And also, if you want to look more into creating a butterfly garden, the Xerces Society has some great lists of flowering plants. And so you can look at their California page. And they also have a lot of really good information on monarchs if you want to learn more about what's going on with monarchs and conservation efforts to help protect them. And then Calscape is also a really good resource, and they have a California page as well you can look at to find out host plants for the caterpillars. And if you want to visit us at any point, we welcome you to visit our social media and our website. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it back over to Michaela, I guess, or if people want to ask questions, feel free to type it into the chat and we can go through some questions.
All right, everybody, you should have an option to add a question via the chat function on Zoom. Attendees will not see the questions. I'll read the questions aloud to Shannon just so we can stay focused on each question, and then she'll provide an answer. So go ahead, if anyone has a question, go ahead and use the chat function. All right, looks like we have our first question. What is the benefit of a curved antenna?
Great question. I don't know, actually. Way to start off the questions, right? With something I don't know.
Rich information here. Does Marin County Open Space do butterfly tours?
Yes, so in non-pandemic times, I typically lead a butterfly walk, one butterfly walk every year. So maybe next spring or summer we can get back to that. So definitely check us out if we're able to get out and lead public groups.
And next one, does the color of caterpillars have any relationship to what the color of the butterfly will be?
No, not necessarily. Again, some butterfly caterpillars have warning coloration, like the pipeline swallowtail caterpillar is velvety black with sort of reddish orange little spines on it, and so that's warning coloration because they're toxic. Some other caterpillars have similar coloring, and then a lot of caterpillars are more cryptic, so they're kind of green and they want to blend into their background so that they can't be easily found by a predator. So the coloring of the caterpillar has more to do with evading predators and also blending into their background and being camouflaged, more so than relating to the adult color.
Next one, how long is the average life of a butterfly?
That's interesting. So as an adult, they typically live a few weeks, but in some cases, as I mentioned, they will overwinter as adults. And so in those species, they obviously are living longer. They're kind of going into what's called diapause. So they're sort of slowing down their metabolism, and then they can live for months. But during the spring and summer, I would say on average, probably a few weeks for most of our species.
And do monarchs gather anywhere in Marin?
Yes, there are some places in Marin. They aren't big gathering spots like you get down Big Sur area, kind of south of here. And the spots that I know of here in Marin are on private property. And those are mostly out in the Bolinas area.
This one's a longer one. You mentioned growing flowering plants in the Cowscape site. Are there a few favorite plants that you would recommend for Marin home gardens? And are native plants better than our nursery varieties?
Good question. Yeah, I would always recommend planting native plants, just because there are other pollinators as well, like bees, and they have evolved these relationships with these plants. And native plants also are just better adapted for our environment regarding how much water they use, things like that. So I would definitely recommend natives if you can. Buckwheats are really popular nectar plants with butterflies, as are buckeye trees. The flowers on buckeye trees attract a ton of different species of butterflies. Things like coyote mint, just thinking off the top of my head. But a lot of different flowers will be visited by butterflies.
Next one, is there a Marin County Butterfly Museum or Reserve?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm pretty sure there isn't a reserve, and I don't know of a museum.
Next one, what are good butterfly walks now?
Kind of hit or miss now. It's funny, normally I would have given this lecture earlier in the season when butterflies were still, there were more of them out and about. Kind of getting late in the season for butterflies, but canyons are kind of a good spot. Like, for instance, Cascade Canyon in Fairfax is a really good place. But along riparian corridors, we have a lot of species that whose host plants are riparian species. So if you head to a canyon, kind of creekside, that can be a good place to look. Buckeye butterflies are found in a lot of different habitats, and they generally, the males kind of patrol fire roads. So as you're hiking along, you can see them flying in front of you and then landing, and then they'll fly again and land. And they're a species that has a few different generations, and so they'll still be flying, all the way into the fall. Some of the others are, maybe already in the chrysalis stage, and they're just gonna stay that way through the winter. And then again, if you think about hill topping, as I mentioned, if you head up to the top of a little knoll or hill or something, you might be able to observe some males that are flying around up there.
All right, looks like we have two more. How does the Priscilla change color based on its environment's color, green versus dry brown?
Yeah, I don't know what the mechanisms are so far as creating that color. I mean, it would be pigment, but basically it is sort of taking note as you, if you will, through its eyes. So it's getting visual cues, and then that's triggering the color that it ends up being.
All right, looks like our last one. When they are overwintering, do they hibernate or eat every day and fly around every day?
Great question. For the most part, they slow down their metabolism and they more or less hibernate. It's not probably technically considered hibernation, but they're inactive for the most part. So they're going to find a protected place to hang out, and they will literally hang out. But sometimes on warm days, they'll take advantage of that. So if you have warm days during the winter, you can see them flying around, and they'll be looking to see if they can find flowers, like, for instance, maybe manzanita. We have manzanita that blooms in the winter, and so on a warm day, they might take advantage of that.
We actually have one more. I skipped over one. This one's the real last one. Are there any overwintering sites on public lands in Marin?
Not that I'm aware of. And if there were, my guess is that they would probably be fairly small. So even on the sites where we know that they overwinter the last couple of years, the numbers haven't been really big. Again, just because those numbers are really decreasing.
Excellent. So that is our last question in the chat. We want to thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoyed and learned something from our interpretive naturalist, Shannon. And keep your eyes peeled on our event calendar and on our social media accounts for any upcoming webinars. We'll try and do this again sometime. Again,
Thanks for joining, everyone. Oops, sorry, Michaela.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
I just wanted to thank everyone for joining in. This was super fun. So
awesome. So thank you all so much.
Bye, y'all. Thanks for coming.